Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barry Bleckman, co-founder of the Stimson Center, and glad to see so many people still care about nuclear weapons. I thought it was just Ward and me at this point, but welcome. This is Ward Wilson. I met Ward, or spoke to him the first time 20 years ago when I read an article he wrote that said, what's this business about the atomic bomb ending World War II? It wasn't that at all. And by that time, I had been working in the field for so long, I was delighted to hear a new argument. So I called him up and we became good friends. And Ward is he's the only person I know who has truly committed himself to eliminating nuclear weapons, and not in the usual way of protesting and so forth, or in the way that Lynn and I and many others do as a physician, as an occupation. Ward has been constructing a theory, a body of knowledge, a way of thinking about nuclear weapons, which is the intellectual foundation, I believe, for getting rid of the damn things. He has shown how useless they are and how we could do and would be much better off without them. So with that, I'm going to give the floor over to Ward.
Well, it's an honor to be here. It will be an honor when you'll know it's an honor when my mic is on. Yes, test, hello? Okay, well, while they're away, I gave you all surveys. This is part of a realist approach to changing minds about nuclear weapons. Please fill out the before side before I infect your minds with lies and stuff. And then afterwards, fill out the same thing again. I am a realist with a small r. I like facts. I think theory is great as a guide to maybe how you might go ahead and get forward. But, test. Hello? Okay, gotcha. I think I'm skeptical about the ability of human nature to change. And anyway, so let's begin. I'm going to try and manage changing two sets of images at once. So forgive me if it's a little herky-jerky. So advocates for nuclear weapons say that it's impossible to eliminate nuclear weapons because, obviously, nuclear weapons have enormous value that makes them indispensable. Their case cites three core facts. Nuclear weapons are decisive in war, nuclear weapons are the ultimate weapon, and they guarantee safety. This is the heart of the question about eliminating nuclear weapons. These three claims. I think these facts are false. Let's look at each in turn. Decisive in war. The proof that nuclear weapons are decisive in war rests entirely on Hiroshima. It is the only non-theoretical experience we have. But what forced Japan to surrender was not the bombing of two cities, but the entry of the Soviet Union, which had been neutral, into the war. Of the many reasons to believe that it was the Russian entry into the war that forced Japan to surrender, let me mention just four. First, we know Japan surrendered because of the Soviet declaration of war, because that's what they said they would do. When the Supreme War Council, the ruling body of Japan, reviewed the war situation in June of 1944, they agreed that if the Soviets came into the war, they would have to surrender. General Kawabe Toroshiro summed up the consensus by saying the absolute maintenance of peace in our relations with the Soviet Union is imperative for the continuation of the war. When then, 2 months later, at midnight on August 8th, 9th, the Soviets did declare war, and Japan's leaders held a series of frantic meetings. They called the Supreme War Council into emergency session to discuss surrender for the first time in 14 years of war. They argued contentiously for several more hours, and at 2 a.m., they tearfully agreed to surrender. So they said they would surrender if the Soviets came in. The Soviets came in, and within 26 hours, they agreed to surrender. So what could be plainer than that? Second, we know that city bombing didn't force them to surrender because Japan's leaders didn't care about city bombing. In the summer of 1945, the United States conducted one of the most ferocious campaigns of city bombing the world has ever known. 68 cities were destroyed, on average one every other day. Yet the Supreme War Council never discussed city bombing or what to do about it. In fact, as far as we know, they only even mentioned the subject twice, once in May and once again in August. As far as cities were going up in smoke, as far as we can tell, the Supreme Council wasn't concerned. They were so unconcerned, it wasn't worth discussing. When Navy Chief of Staff Toyoda Soemu, a member of the Supreme War Council, was asked in his post-war interrogation about the bombing, he said, "I do not believe that the question of air raids came up in the minds of the Supreme War Council at all. That is, there was no idea that we must surrender to avoid even a single day of bombing." Japan's leaders said they would have to surrender if the Soviet Union came into the war. They never said they would have to surrender if more cities were bombed. As far as we can tell, they thought city bombing just didn't matter. Third, war is fundamentally a military contest. Military contests are resolved by military outcomes. When Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Wyatt's brothers fought it out with the Clanton brothers at the OK Corral, it wasn't the side that shot the most bystanders that won the gunfight. It was the side that shot the most gunslingers that won. War is about defeating military forces. Killing civilians may be emotionally satisfying to the bloody-minded, but it is essentially irrelevant to the outcome. And history confirms this. For example, Winston Churchill didn't urge surrender when London was bombed or Coventry was flattened, and Hitler didn't surrender when Hamburg was burned and 37,000 people were killed, and Stalin didn't surrender when Leningrad was besieged for 872 days and something like 1 million civilians starved to death. But perhaps the clearest picture of the place that civilians occupy in wartime calculations comes from China. 1938, the Japanese broke through in central China, and they appeared ready to conquer the entire country. And so Chiang Kai-shek, the country's leader, ordered that the dams on the Yellow River be blown. And the subsequent flooding did, in fact, slow Japan's advance and allowed for Chinese forces to reorganize. You could argue that Chiang's decision saved China from Japanese conquest. The flooding also, however, killed 500,000 civilians. Chiang, by his own order, killed 500,000 of his own civilians. Throughout history, leaders haven't surrendered in order to protect civilians from being killed. So if Japan's leaders surrendered because of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were the most tender-hearted leaders of wartime countries in history. But that seems unlikely because Japan's leaders were almost all military men who had been inculcated with Bushido, a harsh and demanding warrior's code that came down from the samurai. To give a sense of how harsh and demanding, Bushido insisted that leaders who made mistakes had to commit ritual suicide to atone, and soldiers should never surrender. To see Bushido in practice, consider Iwo Jima. When the U.S. invaded Iwo Jima, there were 22,000 Japanese soldiers on that island. Of those 22,000, only 216 were taken prisoner. That means 99.1% of those Japanese soldiers fought to the death. It seems like Japan's leaders believed that when cities were bombed and civilians died, that was simply part of the harsh sacrifice a country had to make in wartime. So the proof that nuclear weapons could force countries to surrender in just days was no proof at all. It is a myth that nuclear weapons were decisive in ending World War II. By the way, it is not realism to imagine that killing civilians wins wars. There are two ways that nuclear weapons can prove that they're the ultimate weapon: on the battlefield and when you use them for long-range attacks on your adversary. So let's look at each in turn. We know that nuclear weapons are effectively useless on the battlefield. It's an open secret in Washington. The facts make that very plain. On a typical battlefield, opposing troops are anywhere from a third of a mile to a few yards apart. A 10-kiloton battlefield nuclear weapon, and the majority of Russian land-based tactical weapons are 10 kilotons. It's about two-thirds of the Hiroshima bomb. A 10-kiloton explosion creates a circle of severe effects that's about a mile across and diminishing effects out to about 5 miles, which means if you use a nuclear weapon against their frontline troops, you will kill some of your frontline troops. But size is not the only problem. Nuclear weapons release radiation, which goes wherever the wind blows it. That same 10-kiloton explosion can spread lethal radiation up to 25 miles in an hour, and less dangerous fallout hundreds or thousands of miles farther. Their size and the uncontrollable nature of radiation make it almost impossible to find a practical, useful role for nuclear weapons on the battlefield. But it's not just hypothetical examples that tell us that nuclear weapons are useless on the battlefield. It's not just 79 years of no one being able to find a practical place where they could use nuclear weapons on the battlefield. The facts have been ratified by the United States government. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush, not a wild-eyed liberal, decided to unilaterally retire all but a symbolic handful of U.S. short-range nuclear weapons with the support of the military. That is Colin Powell in the background saluting. Apparently, after years of careful study, U.S. political and military leaders became convinced that battlefield nuclear weapons had so little utility that they could safely be scrapped, even if no one else scrapped theirs. Similarly, we know that nuclear weapons would be suicidal to use in long-range attacks against your adversary's homeland. Countless war games and studies have confirmed the fact, and again, the conclusions ratified by an American president. No less a hawk than Ronald Reagan said, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought." The reason's simple. If you fight a war with nuclear weapons, after the war ends, your country will be crippled, starving, poisoned, and no longer in control of its own destiny. Canada won't be our 51st state. We'll be Canada's 11th province. Nuclear weapons are simply too big and spread too much uncontrollable poison to be practical weapons of war. Their military utility is simply a myth. It's not realism, by the way, to mistake size for utility. So, of course, nuclear weapons advocates say that nuclear weapons' real value comes from deterrence. Their awesome psychological power, advocates say, is what guarantees our safety. The problem with nuclear deterrence is that it's no more than wishful thinking. We want it to work very badly. And to be fair, it does work some of the time, perhaps even most of the time. But in the long run, it's bound to fail. The reason's obvious. By its very nature, nuclear deterrence has to be perfect. Even a single failure could end up in a catastrophic war, hundreds of millions of people killed. But this requirement of perfection creates a problem because of our human nature. All human beings are fallible. I'm fallible. Is anybody here infallible? From the lowest soldier to the highest leader, none of us can be perfect. And human beings are intimately involved in nuclear deterrence. Deterrence is not a machine that runs on its own in the corner. It's a back and forth process of threats that's entirely governed by human beings. So if human beings are prone to folly, and we are, and if human beings are involved with nuclear deterrence and we manage every step, then nuclear deterrence is, by definition, inherently flawed. It cannot run perfectly forever. Eventually, our luck will run out, and one of those failures will end in catastrophe. It is not a question of if. It is just a matter of when. It is not realism, by the way, to rely for your security on a strategy that will inevitably end in catastrophe. We should have known that from the very beginning, nuclear deterrence couldn't guarantee our safety because, as any genuine realist will tell you, there are no guarantees in life. The guarantee of safety the nuclear weapons advocates promise is a myth. It is not realism to rely for safety on a process that will inevitably be fatal over the long run. Tools and every other kind of technology get abandoned all the time when they are no longer useful. And if they're dangerous as well as useful, they get dropped especially quickly. We need to give up our fantasies about nuclear weapons. They do not give us godlike power. We need to admit that they are both dangerous and virtually useless. If we do that, it's possible to eliminate nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ward. You did cut that down, I must say.
Short this time. I'm trying to make.
We'll take some questions from the audience first and then go outside. Sir, on the right.
After the bombs were dropped, did Russia agree to enter the war afterwards, or would they agree to enter the war before the bombs were dropped?
So at the, I think it's in Iran, at the meeting of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, the Soviets agreed to enter the war, I think it's 3 months after the victory in Europe, which would have been August 15th. So they were scheduled to come in.
When were the bombs dropped?
So Hiroshima is Monday morning, the 6th at 8:15. The Soviets declare war at midnight on Wednesday. And Nagasaki is at about 10:30, 11 the next day. But, so if you want to argue Hiroshima, this is, I've been doing this for a long time.
The last thing the Japanese wanted were the Soviets to occupy them. Their defenses were all in the south against us. They had no defenses up north. And the Soviets are notorious for not being very nice occupiers as compared to...
Did the bombs encourage Russia to join the war?
No, they'd already committed to join.
They had started moving days before.
Yeah, I mean, one point so bombs dropped on Monday, and on Wednesday, the Soviets attacked with 1.2 million men. It takes a long time to get 1.2 million men organized.
Another question? Yeah, sir.
In terms of the rationale or the justification terms of the rationale or justification people have, or leaders have for acquiring nuclear weapons, what about the concept of, if I'm going down, the world might as well end? In other words, imagine, since you started talking about World War II, imagine for a moment that Adolf Hitler had the big button in his bunker, and he knew that it was the end for him, so why not end the world? Just, yeah, let everything go. So don't many leaders aspire to have nuclear weapons because they believe that if I'm going to lose, then everybody might as well be obliterated? So I could think of lots of dictators who might take that attitude, so.
You might be right. Is that an argument in favor of nuclear weapons? And that sounds like a great reason to
In the
grab
back
rid.
there, sir?
So, concerning the logic, thank you. Concerning the logic of disarmament, it does make sense on that front. However, one of the biggest complications with disarmament, obviously, is who puts their guns down first. If the U.S. puts their guns down, what says that everyone else is going to put their guns down as well? I think that's one of the main arguments that still supports holding on to nuclear weapons on that front. And the alternative to that is you just very clearly made a case for why they have limited military utility. They don't really offer much in the way of actual benefits on that front. So then the question is, what happens if everyone starts acknowledging that exact narrative? What happens if that exact point where they lack utility starts proliferating worldwide instead of just in one country?
Okay, so your second question answers your first. But before we get to that, how many people here believe that the only way to disarm is if one country goes first? How many people have heard people argue that that's the only way? Yeah. Yeah, that's never going to happen. As far as I know, there's never been a disarmament of any weapon where one country went first. And I think that it's because the advocates for nuclear weapons were so successful at convincing us all that this is a debate between realists, that's the advocates for nuclear weapons, and idealists who have crack-brained ideas that no one should take seriously. Your second question exactly points to how disarmament happens. Nuclear weapons are mostly reputation. They are the currency of power. People want them because they give them status and a good, warm, fuzzy feeling. So the thing about currencies is that their value can get inflated. The real estate prices will never go down. So the way to get rid of nuclear weapons is not for one country to disarm first or to a coalition to. The way to get rid of nuclear weapons is to crash the market on their reputation. And that can happen quite quickly. If you can destroy the value of their reputation, now everyone is sitting around with these weapons they're looking at and saying, I can never use this. This is a stupid weapon. And then when someone said, does anyone know how long it took to negotiate the Biological Weapons Convention? Anybody? 2 years, start to finish. Worldwide, it's been running for 40 years, no violations. That's what happens when there is a consensus that there's a weapon that is a truly stupid weapon. COVID shows how stupid it is to send shells into another country that blast pathogens, billions of pathogens into the air, sea, and soil. So what you need to eliminate nuclear weapons is not to do anything technical with the weapons. You need to do, the problem is up here that we're locked in this belief that nuclear weapons give us godlike power. And I mean, what did Oppenheimer say? Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Mm-hmm. Which was false twice, because nuclear weapons couldn't destroy our world. There are 800 million people in the southern hemisphere where there are no nuclear weapons, much less Mars or Jupiter. And they certainly can't give us godlike power, as Oppenheimer would have attested once he was shunted off to be the head of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and ignored.
More questions? Sir? Yes,
Thank you very much.
here's the mic.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you a different question. Do you want to comment about Iranian nuclear program? Because Western country believe, and especially United States, that will be a huge nuclear challenge on the Middle East. And do you think that will be danger for future? Or
Iran. Americans admittedly are crazy about Iran. They have unrealistic, there are a lot of Americans with unrealistic assessments of Iran's capabilities. I've never been particularly frightened of Iran's nuclear program because, you know, we built nuclear weapons in 2.5 years. Even the North Koreans didn't take a long time. I mean, it always has seemed to me that if Iran were really serious about building nuclear weapons, they'd have done it. You know, the United States doesn't like things that Iran does, and Iran doesn't like things that the United States does. But I think nuclear weapons is not, yeah, go ahead, Barry.
No, no.
But I don't really have a strong thought about Iran. I'm really focused on getting rid of nuclear weapons. So.
That gentleman in the back there, against the wall.
Thanks so much. Of course, I join you in that idealism. I keep thinking back to R.J. Lifton, who wrote a great deal about the nuclear weapons and also kind of an apocalyptic mindedness that you see in cults, which is basically destroying the world to save the world. And I go back to 1962. I was a child watching the Cuban Missile Crisis. In about 2012, there was a meeting of Russians and Americans when we were still talking, and their historians came here, and like literally Castro was about to use tactical nukes, not ICBMs, but tacticals on our fleet that was steaming toward Cuba. He telex Khrushchev in the middle of the night and said, "Comrade Chairman, we're going to go out in a burst of glory, and communism will live forever," etc. And Khrushchev, who was more of a realist, although he bluffed, totally blinked, and he started to talk to Kennedy. He realized that this madman had these nukes and was about to use them. So we're left in a world where not everything seems so logical, and there are ideologues in the midst of it who will destroy the world to save the ideology. How do you cope with that? I mean,
Well, as I said earlier, I'm a small R realist, and I think one of the biggest problems is that advocates for nuclear weapons have based much of their theory on the notion that in a crisis people will be rational, which, you know, we all hope they will. But there is widespread evidence that human beings are not that rational. We're driven by emotion and instinct and craving. And in fact, the evidence for our irrationality is so pervasive that it is right here in this room. And each of you has access to it. In fact, let me demonstrate. If you reach down and grab a little bit of the flab right over your right hip and pinch it, you will probably think, as I am thinking now, you know, I could really stand to lose 5 or 10 pounds. There is no rational reason to be overweight. So the number of rational people are maybe the number of actually thin, not overweight people. I don't know. It's just,
Boy,
you're rational, Barry.
you're
Look.
wandering around here.
No, I'm just saying
This-
rationality. Yeah.
This lady's been waiting here, please.
Thank you so much.
Please.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you in person. What are your reflections on your work and on deterrence after 2022, the invasion of Ukraine and this past last week's attacks by Ukraine on Russian territory? So the Russian aggression against Ukraine, how does it modify or confirm your, your work, your ideas?
I'll answer
And-
that question, because I was going to close with that. You stole my line. So,
I just wanted to let you know that I am not going to fill up this form, not because I don't respect your work, but because I am biased. I grew up in Costa Rica. I was born in Costa
Okay,
Rica and grew up to
thanks.
be a continent.
Thank you. So, it's very interesting what's going on between Ukraine and Russia. It's not interesting, it's tragic, but it's interesting as it pertains to Ward's talk. In the beginning of the war, Putin couldn't stop saying nuke. Watch out, I'm going to nuke, watch out, I'm going to nuke. Of course, he was just trying to intimidate Biden to keep him from sending over arms, put limits on arms, and so forth. And he carried that out with less and less frequency for a year, maybe into the second year, I don't know. But now we have Ukrainian attacks on Moscow. On Moscow, near the Kremlin. In fact, one was on the Kremlin. And last week, destroying, I don't know if it was 20, 30, or 40, the mixed reports, Russian strategic bombers. But Putin did not say nuclear, not once. Medvedev said it once, but not Putin. So how can he tolerate attacks on his home country, deep in his home country, against his strategic forces, and not retaliate with nuclear weapons? It just reinforces Ward's argument that these are really useless weapons, I think. And I take further comments on that point. I think it's a fascinating point. Okay, I'll get to you. Yes, sir. The blue shirt.
I was going to ask a similar question. You talked about the disutility of nuclear weapons for deterrence and warfighting, but what about coercion? And what about how do you deal with the fear of countries of being coerced by their neighbors? Russia, Ukraine is one example, but North and South Korea is another example, motivating the acquisition of nuclear weapons. How do you respond to those in Ukraine and South Korea who say, either in Ukraine's case, we should have kept them, or in South Korea's case, we need to get them?
Yeah, I would say don't buy symbols, buy weapons. Nuclear weapons are symbols. And, if people believe in them, then they might work or they might not. But weapons are tools that you can pull the trigger and then you can make them work. So I don't know. I don't think it ever makes sense to buy nuclear weapons. If your people are afraid, encourage them to not be afraid.
The South Koreans, of course, had a nuclear weapons program in the 60s, in the 70s, excuse me, when we pulled out of Vietnam. They said, maybe we can't depend on those Americans. And they were persuaded by Henry Kissinger that this was not a good idea and they would lose our support. The Taiwanese had a similar program. And they certainly had the technology and would have developed weapons if they had been left alive to do that. So
you could argue that the fact that so many U.S. allies depend on the U.S. for protection is a measure of the power of economic suasion and the lack of power of nuclear weapons. Because if you are South Korea and the U.S. makes you some promises and promises you lots of economic help, benefits, and you decide not to build nuclear weapons, were you really all that certain that nuclear weapons were absolutely essential to guarantee your safety?
yes, sir, you've been waiting patiently.
What about non-state? What about non-state actors? They can make a dirty bomb or they can make a biological weapon. Anybody with a CRISPR could make something 1,000 times worse than COVID. Does that mean that the major powers should work together to monitor the labs and to cooperate? And what happens if Iran gets bombed? Do they make a nuclear weapon, or do they do it cheaper, just buy some CRISPRs?
Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to say?
I don't know anything. Sorry, you stumped us.
I think non-state actors are, yes, there ought to be lots of careful monitoring. Any treaty requires stringent monitoring if you were going to get rid of nuclear weapons. And someday, someone might, steal a little uranium and create a bomb. Question is, do you want to live in a world where there's a war that kills, 150 million people and devastates civilization, or a world where there's one dirty bomb that goes off somewhere in the world over the next 50 years?
What about the 1,000 times worse than COVID, the cheap bioweapons?
Cheap bioweapons are a problem. We need to be careful with them. I'm not advocating that we be unsafe or uncareful.
Gentleman in the back there, he's been waiting.
Thank you so much. To make all the nuclear-armed states to simultaneously denuclearize, maybe it's also necessary to have a similar civil debate and reflection on nuclear weapons in countries like Russia, China, and North Korea. To have those countries also start thinking about the problems and limits of nuclear weapons. But it has been very challenging to extend that conversation into those societies. How do you propose we engage with the general public in less open societies?
Yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem. Here's the way I imagine it going. There's just one possibility. Lots of people tell their congresspeople, or in the U.S. it becomes commonly accepted that nuclear weapons are stupid weapons that are blundering and clumsy and dangerous. And eventually the president stands up at a State of the Union or something and says, we're not going to get rid of a single weapon, but we now believe that nuclear weapons are not good weapons. We think they're not safe, and they're no longer useful. So we're going to lead a worldwide effort to convince everyone else. We'll start with the Brits. Maybe the Brits come along because they spend 10% of their military budget on nuclear weapons, and they'd love to have that for things they could actually use. Maybe India joins because they have more conventional forces than Pakistan, and it's kind of hard to come over the mountains and invade from China. Let's say the U.S. then, and as soon as the U.S. declares that it's against nuclear weapons, it is immediately at the head of a coalition of 130 nations, because there are already 70 countries that have signed and ratified the TPNW, and another 25 or something that have signed but not yet ratified, and another 30 that support it on a regular basis. So the U.S. is suddenly at the head of the majority of countries in the world. Now, the big get is China, and I don't know how you get China, but China never really was deeply committed to nuclear weapons. At one time, for 30 years, they had 20 nuclear weapons that could reach the U.S., which doesn't really sound like a wholehearted commitment. So maybe there's an opening there. You get the U.S., India, China, maybe England, maybe France, and then suddenly the U.S. leans on Israel, China leans on North Korea and Pakistan. Then you just got Russia. And the fact is, dictators want weapons they can use. They want to conquer the country next door. They want more land. They want to be able to intimidate people, and if they don't get intimidated, use a couple weapons to really show them that they mean business. They don't want weapons you can't use. So once you convince everyone that they're weapons that are useless, it gets a lot easier. It'll be far easier than anything we've ever experienced in terms of negotiations, much more like the BWC.
Thank you, Ward. I see a hand in the left. Justine, do we have questions?
And my question is, in the most of feasible scenarios I see in the future nuclear weapon being used is, let's say China attack Taiwan and the US come to add with Taiwan. You think how you assess like a nuclear weapon was used in that such a scenario? My second question, you mentioned about bring all the country together to do a treaty. And I think you mentioned a nuclear weapon just like a SIMPOS. And I think in 1922, the Washington Navy Treaty is maybe such an example. US and the British and the Imperial Japanese Navy signed a treaty to limit the capital ships. You thinking that, the history can kind of give us a scenario or lessons to we can, sign the treaty with all the nuclear powers?
I think history definitely gives us lessons. I'd choose the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention as they're clearly blundering weapons that are hard to control, and that mirrors the radiation problem with nuclear weapons. But, whatever works, whatever analogy grabs people's imagination would be fine. I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question?
The first question is, like most feasible scenario, we see the future nuclear weapon being used in Taiwan. When U.S. come to add with Taiwan, and when China attack Taiwan, U.S. come to add. Either side, when with losing in the conventional war fighting, maybe they want to start with technical nuclear weapon, then go for nuclear war. So what do you assess that?
The only thing I have to say about that is that I wouldn't want to use a nuclear weapon on an island. So I wouldn't want to use one on Taiwan proper. They're pretty useful against sea flotillas. So, I don't know, you might use one. Ike looked at using nuclear weapons during the Taiwan Straits crisis in '56 and said, the problem is you can't control which way the radiation blows. So I think the problem with nuclear weapons remains that it would be difficult to find a practical use for them unless there's some distant fleet that you want to bomb. But even then, you risk escalation.
Were you talking about Chinese use of nuclear weapons against US forces or vice versa?
Yeah, my main question, I don't think China will use a nuclear weapon in the Taiwan island. Let's say if the U.S. use conventional bombs to bomb China industry base or the military installation in the mainland, maybe China will retaliation with nuclear weapon or the other way. Let's say China attack Guam or the Hawaii, maybe U.S. come back with an attack with nuclear weapons against China cities. So that's my question.
So my answer is, I don't know. But the fact that there are all these scenarios, Iran, Taiwan, Ukraine, means that we should take this issue very seriously. We lived through a period in the 90s and after that was largely peaceful. Everyone got along. Some people hated the U.S. and hated it quietly, but mostly. But those days are over. We're entering a time of much more anger, extremism, fighting.
Thank you. Do we have a question offline somewhere here? Yes.
In a scenario where the big guns, say the U.S. and Russia do go zero, where do you see the deployment of a light missile defense, if at all? Is that zeroed out as well, or is there still a need for the onesies and twosies out there?
So I'm trying to publish a paper about the nuclear revolution. Nuclear weapons didn't force us to rely on deterrence. What forces us to rely on deterrence are weapons that can't be stopped. Because if you can't stop a weapon, the only way you can prevent its use is to threaten hitting back. Weapons that fly are the problem. I think the main area of development in defense in the future will be concealment for targets on the ground and defenses. The Ukrainians proved you need to be able to shoot down drones, or you need to put FedEx out of business, one of the two.
Ma'am?
So a lot of the arguments that you're making are rational, but you're acknowledging that you have to sell that to irrational actors. So how do you bridge that gap? Like the earlier scenario that you said, where if you pitch it from the U.S. side, where we want to push this initiative, we're not going to drop everything, but it's something that we're trying to pursue. How would you prevent sowing mistrust among U.S. adversaries? And then if it needs to be originated outside of a global superpower, how do you sell it to irrational actors and mistrusting actors?
Well, I'll tell you, after looking at these issues for 60 years, I think, in my dark days, I think it's going to take a small nuclear war. That there'll have to be nuclear use before people wake up as to just how dangerous these are. If we're lucky, it'll be small, confined somewhere. That's a dark view, but frankly, I don't know how you can persuade people.
I'm going to try the bright view. And it's just a somewhat lighter shade of dark gray. I'm currently working on, it strikes me that we were once an optimistic country. During the Great Depression, people didn't hang their heads and just sit around. We decided to try to build our way out of it. We built the Grand Coulee Dam, at the time the largest dam in the world. World War II, we were faced a really tough problem. Two, very capable opponents on different sides of the world. We didn't shrink back. We didn't ever have any doubt that we were going to win. You look at the pictures of kids going off to war, and they're all smiling. They're like, we got this, Mom. In the 1960s, we went to the moon, not because there was any point in going to the moon, but because it was hard, and we loved the challenge of doing something difficult. That's who we were. Look at who we are now. We're anxious, we're afraid of everything. Deaths of despair are way up. Deaths from drug addiction. We're at each other's throats. We don't trust each other. I think it's the $200 question. How do you take this rational argument and make it emotional? I know how to do it in the religious sphere, I think. But in the day-to-day, I wonder if we could argue that our loss of confidence, our loss of optimism, the darkness that's kind of settled over our society has something to do with the 80 movies that came out that had an apocalyptic premise in the last decade. The 760 million tickets that were sold to those movies. And if you count Netflix, something like 1.4 million tickets. People have sat and looked at doom. There have been 84 TV shows premised on apocalypse dystopia, some kind of future doom scenario. In the last decade, there were more than 1 million books sold to young adults that were like the Hunger Games, where everything's gone to hell. And the place where it's really metastasized is in video games. A kid sits under a thing and lives in a world where it's all destroyed and it's kill or be killed. And what is it? The one that's set in Fallout 4, they published gameplay statistics after a couple of years of it being released. 2.2 billion hours played. I think there's a case to be made that to be strong, to be vibrant, we have to come out from underneath the cloud. We have to get rid of this doom that hangs over us so that we can breathe deep, try tough things, enjoy ourselves. So maybe that's the way. I don't know.
So while that's an interesting point, I hadn't really considered that, and kind of the element of the nuclear shadow hanging over all of those. I feel like for at least my generation, we aren't really framing our concerns of global destruction around a nuclear sense. So even if you bring the narrative back to all of this would be caused by nuclear weapons or misuse in any case, then there's a long list of other things that are also causing, but whether it's like fracking or whatever. You could make a long list of obviously much less detrimental things. But in terms of selling the story emotionally, I feel like all of those things are also taking space in the mind, making the space for fear about nuclear desolation a lot smaller, if that makes sense. So like climate anxiety in my generation is very high, and it's not really framed around nuclear weapons. So how do you bring the story back to not duck and cover per se, but like kind of make it relevant again? Because I feel like it's kind of a generation gap in terms of they were used in Japan and then they weren't used. So it's only a deterrent in our minds.
So the reason people don't talk about nuclear weapons is because it's an asteroid problem. You know, an asteroid might come sailing out of the depths of space and crash into the Earth and destroy us all. It could happen. It's a realistic possibility. Does anyone here lie awake at night and worry about asteroids? No, because there's nothing you can do. But in the talk that I'm going to give next Monday at Nassau Presbyterian Church, I'm going to end with a thing that says, now you know it can be done. Now you don't have any excuse for putting it in the asteroid category. Now this is a danger we can do something about, and that means we have to do something about it. We'll see. But I agree, you know, there's a lot of other stuff out there that people worry about, and it's a problem. It's a challenge. Get to work on it.
Yeah.
Question about how you see the revolution. How you see the revolution in artificial intelligence, and particularly the growing integration of AI into decision support systems in terms of exacerbating some of the dangers that you're witnessing.
The only thing I think about it is what Jeffrey Lewis told me to think. Jeffrey wrote an article and he said, the problem with AI is that at some point there'll be a crisis and some blips will come up on the radar and they'll turn to the AI and say, what do you think? And AI will say, it's 100% that it's this, because AI is trained to give you answers that sound certain. And so, you know, the problem is false certainty. And I haven't thought very deeply about AI, thank goodness.
I think I could take one more and then.
Hey, good afternoon. So I'm just interested, being a realist, looking at facts, how are you going to convince authoritarian governments or regimes to give up nuclear weapons when we're looking at Saddam Hussein gave up his nuclear ambitions? You could argue that Gaddafi possibly gave up his nuclear ambitions, and both of them are underground now. And then also looking at Ukraine, when they gave up their nuclear weapons after the fall of the Soviet Union, and now they have been invaded twice by Russia.
The thing is, none of those dictators were nuked. They're underground because of conventional weapons. And so if you want to survive, you build conventional weapons, you make allies with other people. I mean, the problem of great power is still the same as it was in the 1800s and the 1700s and the Roman times. If you're a small country, you need to ally with someone who's powerful. You need to not piss off your neighbors. Dictators want weapons that they can use to conquer the next country over. And, if you bomb 3 of the big cities in your neighboring country and all the radiation blows back and you kill 80,000 of your own people, it's hard to keep a grip on the reins of power because people rise up and say, you're an idiot. Dictators want weapons that will work, that they can use. More than anything, they don't want to be stupid because a stupid dictator is one who gets overthrown usually, I guess. Maybe that's not true. Everyone, I hope, got a survey. You filled out the before. Please fill out the after. This is an important realist part of being able to get funding and find out what you believe and what you don't believe. And everyone, thank you.